tent and great audience. Thanks for having me. It's a true privilege being here. As mentioned, I am the CEO of A.P. Møller Holding, which is, as I think some of you know, the parent company of the A.P. Møller Group, known for our shipping activities, but also infrastructure-related activities and energy-related activities, which has often carried the name Mærsk. And during the latter years, we've also built up a growing portfolio of industrial activities. I was asked to speak about our purpose and how we live our purpose. And to do that, I felt it was important to start with our history. So our humble beginning starts in 1883 with this vessel, the Valkyrian. So it was carrying cargo across the Atlantic, and on one of these journeys, when it was bound for Glasgow, it went into a storm, and it lost its sails. A few hours later, it went hard aground, and miraculously, the crew made it ashore that night because some Scottish fishermen saved them. For the master, Peter Møller, and this was my grandfather's grandfather, the crisis was far from over. He had invested his savings in the cargo. Now it was lost, and he had 10 kids to feed back home in Denmark. So as you may appreciate, he needed an income. But it was difficult to find a new job because there were no jobs for old-time sailors during this period. The Industrial Revolution, in fact the second Industrial Revolution, was a real revolution for shipping. And old-age skippers like Peter, who had grown up with sail and rope, were left behind. Peter embraced this difficult challenge. He went back to the school bench at the age of 50, first in Denmark and later in England, to secure the right certificates to work on a vessel not propelled by the wind, but by coal and steam. So as the world moved from sail into the hydrocarbon era, our company took off. So the captain's son, Arnold Peter, who was my great-grandfather, with the support of his father, he then founded what is today known as the A.P. Møller Group. The initial investments were in tramp ships, but soon the company became far more diversified. With that said, the main value driver, and you can say the main job creator for the group, was really the two great tailwinds of the 20th century. And that was the rise of the combustion engine, which created demand for oil products and companies like Mærsk Oil, and the rise of trade, which created demand for shipping services and companies like Mærsk Line and Mærsk Tankers. I'm occasionally asked about my views on business strategies, and I tend to think of Darwin. It seems like the most adaptive survive, so not necessarily the biggest, not necessarily the strongest or the fastest. A Fortune 500 company has a 50-50 shot at making it past my own age, which I think is a fairly sobering statistic for a group which is now more than 120 years old. So while I understand this conference is more about how we as a society at large can come together and make the world a better place, I think sustainability is as much an existential question for any business owner with a generational perspective. So unless we as a group adapt to our world's current challenges, I think we risk becoming quite irrelevant as a business. Now, to be clear, doing good for society is, as you probably all know, is by no means invented by our generation. Stakeholder capitalism is, as I see it, not a new concept. In fact, most of the big foundations in the Nordics were founded by previous generation business owners. And that's also the case for our group. So my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and his siblings set up our foundation 70 years ago. Now, these activities have expanded ever since, and so has our group. But the very purpose of our group stays the same, as clearly outlined in the deed of our foundation. Our purpose is nyttig virksomhet. So our purpose is to invest in and build businesses that have a positive impact on society. So as you may appreciate, ESG and sustainability are not really considered a new activity or a separate function, as it has always been ingrained in our group's market approach. And that brings me to the next slide, just to highlight that in Møller Holding, our purpose is one of 3 critical screening criteria when we review our portfolio, whether we look at our existing holdings, whether we invest in new companies. The other 2 criteria are long-term macro themes, so whether we believe a company would benefit from long-term tailwind, and I'll come back to that shortly. And the third criteria is very much linked to whether we are a relevant owner for the business, which if we believe we can add value to that business as an owner. Now, talk is all cheap. I think my speech here is part of the session falling on the leadership. So how do we actually act on our purpose? So I've tried to sort of categorize our purpose-driven actions or ownership model in 3 buckets. The first one is how we take responsibility and demonstrate leadership for our existing holdings. You can argue these are some of the industries of today. The second bucket is how we can be part of shaping and investing in the industries of tomorrow. And the third bucket is, in more general terms, how we as corporate citizens and shareholders can become a force for public good beyond our business models. So let me start with the first category, our existing holdings. So we've been in shipping and logistics for more than 100 years, and we hold a firm belief in the so-called multiplier effects of trade. So one very concrete example, transportation and logistics are absolutely essential services to help farmers in the developing markets in Africa, in Latin America and Asia, to get their produce and products beyond the local markets to a global market. We know from experience that this will help create jobs locally in these developing markets, and it will eradicate poverty. Moreover, cold chain solutions such as reefer containers, they reduce food waste. 1/3 of global food waste happens post-harvest. And this carries, a cost of billions of dollars and significant emissions. And it happens primarily in poor communities. So also in this respect, our shipping activities can have a real positive impact. With all this said, we fully appreciate that we carry a significant footprint, a significant carbon footprint as a result of our shipping activities. So as a result, we also try to change our industry from within. I think the team at Mærsk is doing an absolutely marvelous job and show courageous leadership. As some of you may know, they've recently ordered new vessels with engine technology catering for green fuels, to be more precise, green methanol. And this is an attempt to try to crack what I call the chicken and egg dilemma, with no one willing to produce green fuels unless there is a demand for it. But there are also many other examples of how we try to use our capabilities to change some of our industries or be a force for good in our existing industries. For example, a few years ago, we launched Møller Capital, which is an infrastructure arm, where we've sort of reused our capabilities from having developed one of the world's biggest port operators to now, with the help of pension funds, allocate more capital to Africa's infrastructure, a continent which is in dire need of basic infrastructure within transport and energy to sustain its enormous population growth of more than 1 billion people over the next 30 years. So that was the sort of the first bucket, so how we try to address some of our current industries in a positive way. So the second bucket is how we try to be part of the industries of tomorrow. A few years ago, we initiated what I believe has been the biggest corporate restructuring in our group's history. The purpose was really twofold. On one hand, to transform our shipping and logistics activities, but the second objective was to initiate a renewal of our group. We have done so by divesting some of our activities. We sold Mærsk Oil a few years ago, dramatically reducing our portfolio's hydrocarbon footprint. And at the same time, we have started investing in new industries. And in industries where we have a strong belief they will have a positive impact on society or be part of accelerating societal change in a positive way. And coming back to my previous point about tailwinds, where we believe there is a sort of a long runway for investments. We have so far focused on two macro themes: the green energy transition and circularity. A good example of the latter is Mærsk, a company we acquired only a few months ago. Mærsk is Europe's leading producer, I would argue the world's leading producer, of sustainable plastic and packaging material to the food industry. And they have this circular approach where they reuse and recycle plastic, so their products contain up to 100% recyclable circular products. And by using, so this will of course reduce plastic waste, but by reusing plastic and using plastic as opposed to some other materials, these packaging products also have fairly good properties, meaning they extend the shelf life of some food products, meaning that they also reduce food waste. And we have done many more acquisitions over the last few years. We've acquired industrial companies like KK Wind Solutions and Nissen's Cooling, which play a critical role for the development of the renewable industry. Beyond bigger acquisitions, we've also occasionally supported entrepreneurial efforts and startups which somehow benefit from our capabilities and know-how. I know Laura is here today from Sear North, a very exciting software company which offers a software as a service to the global merchant fleet to reduce their fuel consumption and thus reduce their CO2 in a very impactful way. We have also had a very interesting startup within the geothermal space. When we sold Mærsk Oil a few years ago, some of our colleagues came to us and said they wanted to develop geothermal energy as a truly circular form of energy for the district heating industry. So 13% of Europe's carbon emission comes from buildings, and the bulk of that is related to heating. So this team had a strong belief that they could use geothermal energy and they could replace gas, they could replace biomass and other forms of baseload with geothermal energy for district heating. This has been a long journey, but after 3 years, we are now getting close to signing an agreement which may be the development or the beginning of potentially the biggest geothermal plant in Europe. So hopefully you will hear more about this in the coming month. Now that's a bit about how we invest in new industries. So let me get to the last category. And that's really how we can have a positive impact beyond our you can say our business models. I know many cynics may say that companies only act out of self-interest and for profit. That's not always bad. I think if you sort of have long-term profitability in mind, that can be a very good lever for change today. And there are many good examples. Here in Denmark, the transformation of Dong into Ørsted, I think is an excellent example of how sustainability and financial value creation go hand in hand. But we do have quite a few not-for-profit or non-profit activities in our group. And I would sort of categorize these pro bono activities in two different categories. The first one is, of course, the work of our foundations. So part of our profits in the group go up to our foundations, and then they are then deployed as donations to various public projects. Our foundations typically would donate around $100 million per year, sometimes more. And to various projects, we've had many donations going into research and education. We've had a lot of donations going to cultural activities. Over the last decades, this very city, Copenhagen, has become a greener city because our foundation has funded some of the new parks in the city. And we have also had a significant engagement with establishing non-profit endeavors and other foundations, such as the Zero Carbon Center for shipping. But what I find most interesting is actually our second kind of pro bono activity, which I believe carries far more impact than our donations. And that is the work carried out by our employees and by our corporations when they support society in times of crisis. And there are many, many examples of how some of our companies have stepped up when there's been a crisis of some kind. And the most recent example is the pandemic. So during March last year, we were contacted by hospitals in Denmark, and they were desperate to get their hands on face masks and other personal protective equipment. So with a big organization in China, we were able to source many of these masks, and then we established an air bridge. And this is a picture of the first flight from China with the world's biggest freight flight, a freight plane, an Antonov, which arrived in Copenhagen during the spring of last year with several millions of face masks. And that air bridge then continued for several weeks, and after a while we turned it into a shipping bridge, supporting hospitals in this part of the world with protective equipment. And I think this is the most important part or point I would like to make in my speech. I think the impact of our colleagues at sea, in ports, in warehouses, in factories and other locations across the world should not be underestimated. It's quite significant. Especially during the pandemic, to this very day, we've had many colleagues making huge sacrifices, being away from their families for many, many months, to be part of supporting society and the global supply chain to make sure communities receive their share of critical goods, from food to different kinds of fuels. So I would like to end my speech to you with a brief video which I think highlights our colleagues' fantastic work to make our lives better.
As we look to the future, when life starts returning, this is for all who keep the world turning. All you, fruit pickers, freight packers, shelf stackers, shipment trackers, supply chainers, fillers of containers. All you seafarers, take good carers, skippers, shippers, frontliners, always get it there on timers. All you dockers, truckers, connectors and protectors. All you who handle cargo planes or trains or ship-to-shore cranes, who kept warehouses stocked, made sure supplies never stopped. All night, all day, come what may. To all of you, we'd like to say thanks for going all the way.
Thank you, Robert. That was really inspiring and also just reminded of how impressive all the changes that you're making are and what they require, and a certain leap of faith too, that technology will catch up with some of the visions that you have for the world. There's so much to discuss, and we have very little time, but I thought maybe one of the things that you mentioned, your operations in the world, also touches upon infrastructure in the global south. And looking at that, developing economies and how they are transitioning, and how that meets the green agenda and all of the things that we're working on, you're working on. What are the trade-offs in your mind between supporting economic growth in the developing economies versus the direction that we need to travel in, and how do we support them as well in that transition?
So I think this is one of the most important and difficult questions. As I mentioned in my speech, we raised a fund a few years ago to support infrastructure development in Africa. And the team has now almost deployed that fund and are considering raising a second fund. And one of the considerations is whether to allow for hydrocarbon-related investments or only focus on green investments as part of that fund. And that is a very difficult discussion. In Africa, hundreds of millions lack proper electricity. Even in big cities and developed markets in Africa, like Kenya, you go to Nairobi, you have blackouts quite often. So there is not a stable baseload. And some of these countries have actually developed far more renewables than our own countries. So I think in Kenya, that you have around 70% renewable energy, but still there is a need for proper baseload. And people in Africa would like to see investments also in, for example, gas-powered utilities. Many of the DFIs and aid agencies of the world would not like to see that and would not support it. But I certainly have some degree of, or I have appreciation and understanding for some of these requirements locally. Because if you don't have proper access to electricity, it's very difficult to address sort of some of the social inequalities we see in the world. So I do believe that we should be very careful we don't sort of implement what I call energy apartheid, where we extract oil and gas from Africa, which is happening today, and that oil and gas is then used in the Western world. I think if we sort of think about the world as having a global carbon budget, I think we need to appreciate that part of that budget will have to be allocated to emerging markets.
And with COP coming up in November,
yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could give your thoughts and reflections on what you hope to see coming out of that, and what you think is the reality that's going to come out of that, and how you sort of play a role in that debate.
Yeah, so I think for shipping, if you look at our initiative to acquire vessels with green methanol technology, it's very clear that green methanol will be very expensive to produce compared to low sulfur diesel. So in order for companies like ourselves to be competitive when we sail on green fuels, there will have to be a carbon tax. So I think from a global point of view, a global carbon tax is essential if you're going to see an energy transition in global shipping, because it is a global market and you can't regulate it locally.
And I know we don't have a lot of time left, but given that we're in a room full of business leaders here today, I'm just wondering sort of what your experience and expertise has taught you that you wanted to pass on to CEOs and business leaders in the room to take away.
I think there are people who are more experienced than me in this room. I think what's sort of really powerful for us when we've done this restructuring and when we discuss strategy, especially in the holding company, is to use purpose as the starting point for a strategy discussion. But I think it has to be authentic. When we discuss corporate values or a corporate purpose, it has to be real. It can't be a separate exercise. It has to be authentic. And I think employees, appreciate if it's authentic or not, and they will know that. And what I've noticed, we've hired a lot of investment professionals who come from the private equity industry, and while we offer competitive terms, I think it's quite clear that many of them can make a lot more in terms of their income elsewhere, but that the purpose itself has been a very strong attraction point for many of them. So it at least for us, I think it's partly differentiated when we attract talent from the financial markets.
And who do you turn to yourself when you're considering, the next steps forward in the years ahead? Who do you lean on and turn to?
So I try to speak to as many as possible. I think there are plenty of very exciting young entrepreneurs. I think if you talk about some of the startups in the clean tech space, from Climeworks to Carbfix, there are plenty of really inspirational young leaders. But there's also plenty to learn from, I think, the older generation. I don't think stakeholder capitalism in any way is sort of something which the next generation has come up with. I think there are very relevant perspectives from older generations. So I try to engage with business leaders and people across generations. On my own board, I even have a person who's just turned 80, and he has wonderful perspectives on some of these questions.
Well, thank you so much. I know we're out of time, but thank you so much for your time and for answering the questions and for your great presentation today. Real inspiration, and thank you for tackling the question of leadership. A warm round of applause for Robert. Thank you so much.